Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving deep into Niall Ferguson's Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe.
A fascinating choice.
It is. Now, I've always kind of been fascinated by, those what-if scenarios, those moments in history where things could have gone very, very differently. And that's exactly what Ferguson tackles in this book. He takes us on this whirlwind tour of disasters throughout history, from the Black Death to Chernobyl, even to COVID-19.
Yeah.
But it's not just about recounting these calamities, right?
Yeah, it's more about, trying to understand that complex interplay of factors that lead to these events and more importantly, how societies respond, why some are more resilient than others, and how we can learn from the past to better navigate, an increasingly uncertain future.
Right. It's like he's saying, hey, disasters are a part of human history, but how we deal with them, that's what really matters. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty, let's take a step back and lay out the main themes running through the book. What really jumped out at me was Ferguson's exploration of our fascination with doom, those cognitive biases that make us bad at assessing risk, and how those tendencies play out in real-world disasters. He delves into those historical examples we mentioned, highlighting recurring patterns of collapse, resilience, and the crucial role of governance. Of course, he doesn't shy away from the present, tackling the U.S.-China rivalry and the potential for a new Cold War.
Yeah, he even argues that this rivalry might not necessarily be a bad thing, suggesting it could be a catalyst for innovation and renewal in the West. It's a bold statement and definitely sparked some debate.
It did. Okay, so let's dive into the first part of the book where Ferguson sets the stage by exploring this allure of doom. He talks about how we're drawn to predictions of catastrophe, even when they lack specifics. It's almost like a morbid curiosity, isn't it? Like rubbernecking at a car accident.
It is, and he argues that this fascination stems from our deep-seated need to make sense of the world, to find patterns and meaning even in chaos. But as he points out, this often leads us to oversimplify complex problems and to fall prey to what he calls magical thinking.
Ah, yes. Magical thinking, that idea that we can somehow control events through rituals or beliefs, or even conspiracy theories, like if we can just find the right explanation, the right scapegoat, that we can somehow ward off disaster.
Exactly. And Ferguson gives this great example from Jeffrey Grimmett's play, The Imminent Eschaton, where a dinner party suddenly ends in disaster. And the cause, bad salmon mousse. It's a humorous anecdote, but it highlights how we crave these, neat, easily digestible explanations, even when the reality is far more complex and often mundane.
It's funny because it's true. We want to believe there's a reason, a purpose, even when it comes to random, unpredictable events. But Ferguson argues that this kind of thinking can actually be dangerous because it prevents us from seeing the real risks and taking appropriate action.
He points out that our brains haven't really evolved to handle the complexities of the modern world.
Yeah.
We're still wired to respond to immediate threats, like a saber-toothed tiger lurking in the bushes, not these slow-burning systemic risks like climate change or pandemics.
It's like we're driving a car designed for the Stone Age on a high-speed freeway. No wonder we're having trouble keeping up.
Right. And this leads us to Ferguson's discussion of gray rhinos and black swans, which you mentioned earlier. He argues that many disasters like pandemics are actually predictable, these gray rhinos staring us right in the face. But we often fail to act because the threat seems too distant or too abstract or too overwhelming to comprehend.
It's like that saying, a boiling frog doesn't realize it's being cooked until it's too late.
Exactly. And then there are the black swans, those truly unpredictable events that seem to come out of nowhere. Think about the 9/11 attacks or the 2008 financial crisis. These events catch us off guard not because they're inherently unpredictable, but because our mental models simply don't account for them.
We get so focused on what we think we know, on those patterns we've identified, that we miss the signals that something truly novel is about to happen. And then, boom, we're blindsided.
And that's where the danger lies. Because when we're surprised when our assumptions are shattered, that's when we're most vulnerable to panic, to making rash decisions, to falling prey to those magical thinking tendencies Ferguson talks about.
It's like when you're driving and you suddenly hit a patch of black ice. Your instincts might tell you to slam on the brakes. But that's actually the worst thing you can do. You need to stay calm, steer into the skid, and adjust your course based on the new reality.
That's a great analogy, and I think that's really what Ferguson is trying to teach us in Doom. He wants us to develop those mental reflexes, those cognitive skills, that will allow us to navigate a world that's increasingly complex, interconnected, and unpredictable.
So we need to be aware of our biases, be willing to challenge our assumptions, and be prepared to adapt to changing circumstances. But how do we actually do that? I mean, it's one thing to talk about these concepts in the abstract, but how do we apply them to our everyday lives?
That's where the historical examples Ferguson provides become so important, because by studying how past societies have dealt with disasters, both successfully and unsuccessfully, we can start to identify those patterns of behavior, those decision-making processes that lead to resilience or collapse.
So it's about learning from the past, not just to avoid repeating mistakes, but to develop a better understanding of how human societies function under pressure.
Exactly, and that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at specific historical examples, from the Black Death to the Irish potato famine to Chernobyl, to see how those patterns of collapse and resilience have played out in the real world.
Sounds fascinating. I can't wait to dig into those historical case studies.
Me neither. There's a lot to unpack there, but before we do, I want to highlight one more key point from this first section. Ferguson argues that disasters are rarely purely natural or man-made. They're almost always a complex interplay of both, often amplified by network effects.
Right. He emphasizes that we can't just blame nature or human stupidity. It's usually a combination of factors interacting in unpredictable ways that leads to these catastrophic events.
And understanding that complexity is essential for developing effective solutions. We can't just focus on preventing natural disasters or controlling human behavior. We need to address both. And we need to consider how those factors interact within the larger system.
It's about seeing the bigger picture, the interconnectedness of everything. And that's a theme that runs throughout the entire book.
Absolutely. And it's a theme we'll be returning to again and again as we delve deeper into doom.
Okay, so we've laid out the groundwork, explored this allure of doom, and touched on those key concepts of gray rhinos, black swans, and magical thinking. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll be putting these ideas into practice by examining specific historical disasters.
We'll see how those cognitive biases Ferguson talks about have played out in the real world, how societies have responded to those challenges, and what lessons we can learn from their successes and failures.
Sounds like a plan. I'm ready to travel back in time.
Yeah.
And see what insights we can glean from the annals of history. Stay tuned.
All right, so we've established that disasters are rarely just, acts of God or purely human-made. They're this intricate dance between nature's volatility, our choices, and how we're all connected.
Yeah, and to really grasp that, Ferguson takes us back in time, right? He dives into some major historical calamities to show these patterns in action. What better place to start than the granddaddy of pandemics, the Black Death? I mean, talk about a global catastrophe.
Exactly, and Ferguson really brings that era to life.
Yeah.
He describes the sheer terror, the rapid spread, and the devastating impact it had on societies across Europe. But here's where it gets interesting. He doesn't just stop at the horror. He digs into the aftermath, showing how the Black Death, while horrific, unexpectedly reshaped the social and political landscape.
Okay, unpack that for me. I'm all ears.
Well, take England, for example. Ferguson argues that the Black Death, despite wiping out a huge chunk of the population, actually strengthened the English state. Think about it, labor became scarce, giving peasants more bargaining power. This forced the crown to impose wage and price controls, something previously unimaginable. They also needed to increase taxes to make up for lost revenue. These measures, born out of crisis, actually expanded state power in ways that reverberated for centuries.
Wow, that's a perspective I hadn't considered. It's like, out of devastation came new forms of social and political control. Talk about unintended consequences.
Cool.
Right. And Ferguson masterfully highlights those unintended consequences. He then contrasts the Black Death with another catastrophe, the Irish potato famine. Here we see a different dynamic at play. Instead of a bubonic plague sweeping through populations, you have potato blight, a natural pathogen that decimated Ireland's staple food crop.
And if I remember correctly, this famine wasn't just about a bad harvest. There was a whole lot of human mismanagement that turned it into a full-blown tragedy, right?
You're absolutely right. The British government's response, or lack thereof, was a textbook example of how ideology and inaction can amplify a disaster. Their laissez-faire approach, a belief that the market would sort itself out, tragically failed. They were slow to provide aid. Their relief efforts were inadequate, and their policies actually worsened the situation. Ferguson argues that the Irish potato famine is a stark reminder that good governance is crucial during a crisis. It's not enough to simply react. You need to anticipate, coordinate, and adapt to changing circumstances.
Yeah, that resonates with what we talked about earlier, those cognitive biases and the allure of simple explanations. It's easy to fall back on ideology or blame external forces when a complex problem arises.
Precisely. Now let's fast forward to a more recent disaster, Chernobyl. This one's a chilling example of how technological hubris, coupled with a culture of secrecy, can lead to catastrophe. Ferguson meticulously lays out the technical flaws in the reactor's design and the series of human errors that culminated in the meltdown. But he goes further, pointing a finger at the Soviet system itself.
So it wasn't just about bad engineering or a few people messing up, it was something more systemic.
Exactly. The Soviet Union's culture of secrecy and its rigid hierarchy meant that problems were often hidden or downplayed. There was a reluctance to admit mistakes, a fear of rocking the boat. This lack of transparency made it incredibly difficult to address the underlying issues that ultimately led to the disaster.
It's like they were trying to cover up a crack in the dam with a Band-Aid.
And
Eventually, the pressure just builds up and the whole thing bursts.
that's a great way to put it. And it's a reminder that institutions, just like individuals, can suffer from cognitive biases. They can become blind to their own flaws, clinging to outdated models or ways of thinking, even when faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
You know, that brings to mind another point Ferguson makes about the importance of communication, especially during a crisis. He contrasts Chernobyl with the 3 Mile Island incident in the U.S., which, while serious, was nowhere near as catastrophic.
Yes. And he argues that a key difference was the way information was handled. In the U.S., despite initial missteps, there was a greater degree of transparency. Officials were more willing to acknowledge the problem, communicate with the public, and seek outside expertise. This open approach, while certainly not perfect, helped to contain the damage and prevent widespread panic.
So it's not just about having good technology or competent leaders. It's also about creating a culture that encourages open communication, critical thinking, and a willingness to learn from mistakes.
Absolutely. Now bridging the gap between past and present. Ferguson brings us to the COVID-19 pandemic. What's striking is how he draws parallels between the initial responses to COVID-19 and historical pandemics. It seems like we humans have a tendency to repeat the same mistakes. Even when we have all this accumulated knowledge.
It's almost like we're doomed to repeat history even when we know better. But what are some of those specific parallels he highlights?
Well, one is the tendency to downplay or dismiss early warnings. He points out how many countries, including those considered well prepared, initially ignored or minimized the threat posed by the virus. We see the same pattern with the Black Death, the Spanish flu, and countless other outbreaks throughout history.
It's like we have this collective blind spot when it comes to exponential growth. We can't seem to grasp how quickly a small problem can spiral out of control.
Right. And Ferguson argues that this blindness stems from our difficulty in dealing with uncertainty and our preference for simple, linear explanations. We like to believe that things will continue as they always have, that the future will be a predictable extension of the past. But as he so eloquently demonstrates, the world is full of surprises.
And those surprises often come in the form of black swans, those unpredictable events that shatter our assumptions and force us to reevaluate everything.
Exactly. And that's why Ferguson emphasizes the importance of adaptability, of being able to adjust our course when the unexpected happens. He argues that societies that are flexible, that can learn and adapt quickly, are the ones that are most likely to survive and thrive in the face of adversity.
So it's not just about being tough or having the best resources. It's about being nimble, being able to change direction when the winds shift. It's almost like a mental agility, isn't it?
It is, and it's something that we can all cultivate, both individually and collectively. It's about being open to new information, being willing to question our assumptions, and being prepared to change our minds when presented with new evidence.
You know, it's interesting how Ferguson connects this idea of adaptability to his discussion of network structures, which we touched on earlier. He argues that understanding how networks function is essential for mitigating disasters, especially in our hyper-connected world.
Absolutely. He explains how pandemics, financial crises, even political revolutions can spread like wildfire through these complex networks of human interaction. He uses the term superspreaders to describe those individuals or events that can dramatically accelerate the contagion.
Right. And that applies not just to diseases, but to information as well. Think about how quickly misinformation can go viral on social media, shaping public opinion and influencing the course of events.
It's like a virus of the mind,
Yeah.
exploiting our cognitive biases and amplifying those tendencies towards fear, outrage, and tribalism.
And as Ferguson points out, this infodemic can be just as dangerous as any biological pandemic, undermining trust in institutions, fueling social unrest, and hindering our ability to respond effectively to real-world challenges.
It's a sobering thought, but I think Ferguson offers us a way forward. He argues that we need to develop a new kind of literacy, A network literacy that will allow us to understand these complex systems, identify those points of vulnerability, and develop strategies to mitigate the risks.
It's like learning to read the map of the 21st century, a map that's constantly evolving, full of unexpected turns and hidden connections.
And that brings us to one of the most controversial and thought-provoking aspects of doom, Ferguson's analysis of the new Cold War between the US and China. He doesn't just see it as a political or economic rivalry, but as a clash of civilizations, a fundamental conflict between two very different ways of seeing the world.
Now, this is where things get really interesting, because Ferguson doesn't shy away from taking sides. He argues that the West, with its emphasis on individual liberty and democratic values, is ultimately the better system. But he also acknowledges the strengths of the Chinese model, with its focus on collective action and long-term planning.
He even suggests that this new Cold War might not necessarily be a bad thing. He argues that it could actually be a catalyst for renewal in the West, forcing us to confront our own weaknesses, to rediscover our core values, and to invest in the technologies and institutions that will ensure our long-term survival.
It's a provocative argument for sure, and one that has sparked a lot of debate. But I think it's a debate we need to have, because understanding the nature of this rivalry, the stakes involved, and the potential consequences is essential for navigating the 21st century.
Absolutely. And I think Ferguson, despite his strong opinions, does a great job of laying out the complexities of this issue. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but he gives us the tools we need to think critically about the challenges ahead.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the Black Death to Chernobyl to COVID-19 to this new Cold War between the U.S. and China. What's the common thread running through all these historical examples? What's the key takeaway that Ferguson wants us to grasp?
I think it's this: disasters are not just about the events themselves, but about our responses to them. The choices we make, the leaders we elect, the institutions we build, and the stories we tell ourselves all play a role in shaping the outcome.
It's not just about being tough or resilient. It's about being smart, about understanding how complex systems work,
Yeah.
and about making informed decisions based on the best available evidence.
Exactly. And that's where the real challenge lies. Because as Ferguson points out, our brains are wired for simplicity, for certainty, for those easy answers that often lead us astray.
So it's a battle against our own nature, against those cognitive biases that have been ingrained in us for millennia.
It is. But it's a battle we can win. Because we also have the capacity for reason for critical thinking, for learning from our mistakes and adapting to changing circumstances.
So it's about harnessing those higher-level cognitive functions, those uniquely human abilities that allow us to transcend our instincts and make conscious choices based on evidence and logic.
Right, and that's what doom is ultimately about. It's not a prediction of inevitable catastrophe. It's a call to action, a plea for us to wake up to the realities of the 21st century and to embrace those tools that will allow us to build a more resilient, adaptable, and ultimately more humane future.
I love that. It's not a book about giving in to despair, but about empowering ourselves to create a better future. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, those network effects that can amplify disasters. I'm still a bit fuzzy on how exactly those work.
Okay, let's break that down a bit further. Imagine a network as a web of connections, kind of like a social network. But it could also be a network of transportation routes, financial institutions, or even ecosystems.
Got it. So it's about how things are interconnected, how one event can ripple through the entire system.
Exactly. And what Ferguson highlights is that these networks often have a scale-free structure. This means that a few nodes in the network have a disproportionate number of connections. Think about social media influencers, for example. They have millions of followers while most people have just a few hundred.
So it's not like a neat, evenly distributed grid, but more like a web with a few giant spiders at the center. I'm starting to see how that could be relevant to disasters.
Right, because if a virus, a financial shock, or even a piece of misinformation happens to infect one of those highly connected nodes, it can spread like wildfire through the entire network.
It's like those super spreaders we talked about earlier. One person at a conference or a church service can affect dozens or even hundreds of others.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these network dynamics is so crucial. For mitigating disasters, we need to identify those highly connected nodes, monitor them closely, and develop strategies to prevent them from becoming points of failure.
It's almost like we need to become network whisperers, able to understand the language of these complex systems and influence their behavior.
I love that analogy. And it's a skill that's becoming increasingly important in the 21st century where everything is connected. And those network effects can amplify both the good and the bad.
It's like we're all part of this giant web of interdependence, and we need to learn to navigate it wisely if we want to avoid getting tangled up in the threads of disaster.
Well said. And I think that's a great note to end this part of our deep dive. We've explored the historical patterns of collapse and resilience, the importance of good governance and effective communication, and the growing significance of these network effects that are shaping our world.
In the next and final part, we'll delve into Ferguson's more philosophical reflections on the nature of doom, the limits of our knowledge, and the choices we face as we navigate an increasingly complex and uncertain future. Stay tuned for that. Okay, so we've journeyed through history, witnessing those recurring patterns of collapse and resilience. We've seen how human choices, network effects, and nature's volatility kind of combine to create these moments of catastrophe. But as we wrap up our deep dive into doom, I'm curious to explore Ferguson's bigger picture reflections. He seems to be grappling with some profound questions about the nature of knowledge, the limits of prediction, and the very idea of progress.
Yeah, you're right. He definitely goes there. He doesn't shy away from the philosophical implications of his analysis. One of the most thought-provoking concepts he introduces is this idea of the problem of recursion. It's a bit mind-bending, but essentially he's arguing that predictions, especially those about complex systems like societies, can actually influence the very events they're trying to foresee.
Oh, wow. So it's not just that we're bad at predicting the future, but that our very attempts to predict it might be altering the course of events. That's kind of trippy.
It is. Think about it this way. If people believe a financial crash is imminent, they might pull their money out of the market, triggering the very collapse they feared. Or if leaders believe a war is inevitable, they might start making aggressive moves that escalate tensions and make conflict more likely.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but on a societal scale.
Yeah.
Our beliefs about the future can actually shape the future. That raises some serious questions about the limits of our knowledge and the very nature of causality.
It does. And Ferguson doesn't offer any easy answers. He acknowledges that we can never fully escape this recursive loop, but he argues that we can become more aware of it, more conscious of how our beliefs and actions can shape the course of events.
It's like he's urging us to take responsibility, not just for our individual choices, but for our collective narratives about the future.
Exactly. And that ties into another key theme he explores, the idea of progress. He challenges this linear view history as an inevitable march towards a brighter future. He reminds us that progress is not guaranteed, that there are always setbacks, always cycles of growth and decline, always the potential for things to go horribly wrong.
Yeah, he uses that powerful quote from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't panic, to illustrate this point. It's a reminder that we need to stay calm, think clearly, and not let fear or despair cloud our judgment, especially when facing these complex challenges.
And that's where Ferguson's insights about resilience become so crucial. He argues that true resilience is not about bouncing back to some predetermined state, but about adapting to changing circumstances, about learning from our mistakes, and about using those lessons to build a better future.
So it's not about clinging to the past or trying to control the future. It's about embracing uncertainty, being flexible, and having the courage to course correct when things inevitably go wrong.
It's about navigating, not conquering the challenges ahead. And one of the key tools he offers for this navigation is a deeper understanding of networks, which we discussed earlier.
Right. He makes a compelling case for developing what he calls network literacy, the ability to understand how these complex systems work, to identify those points of vulnerability, and to use that knowledge to build more resilient and adaptable structures.
He argues that this kind of literacy is becoming essential in the 21st century, where everything is interconnected, and those network effects can amplify both the good and the bad. It's about seeing the bigger picture, understanding how seemingly disparate events are linked, and recognizing the potential for both cascading failures and emergent solutions.
It's like learning to see the forest for the trees, but on a global scale. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of everything and understanding how our actions can ripple through those complex webs of relationships.
And it's about embracing complexity, not shying away from it. Ferguson reminds us that the world is messy, unpredictable, and often defies our attempts to impose order or control. But within that messiness, within that unpredictability, lies the potential for creativity, for innovation, for those unexpected breakthroughs that can reshape our world.
So it's not about giving in to despair or clinging to simplistic solutions. It's about embracing the unknown, acknowledging the risks, and using our ingenuity and adaptability to navigate those turbulent waters.
He even suggests that this embrace of uncertainty, this willingness to challenge our assumptions and adapt to changing circumstances, might be the very thing that saves us from those doom-laden scenarios we often envision.
It's about finding that sweet spot between complacency and panic, between clinging to the past and fearing the future. It's about being present, engaged, and informed, ready to act decisively, but also to course correct when necessary.
And that brings us back to one of the most enduring themes of doom, the importance of human agency. Despite all the talk of network systems and those forces beyond our control, Ferguson reminds us that we are not passive passengers on this journey. We have choices to make, actions to take, and a responsibility to shape the future we want to inhabit.
I love that. It's a call to action, a reminder that we're not just victims of circumstance, but active participants in shaping our own destiny. But what does that look like in practice? I mean, how do we translate these big ideas into concrete actions? That can make a difference.
Well, I think Ferguson offers us a few pathways forward. One is to cultivate that network literacy we talked about, to become more aware of those interconnected systems, to understand how they function, and to think strategically about how we can influence their behavior.
So it's about moving beyond those linear cause and effect models and embracing a more systemic way of thinking. It's about recognizing the ripple effects of our actions,
Right.
both intended and unintended.
Exactly. Another pathway is to invest in institutions that promote critical thinking, adaptability, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. He highlights the importance of having a robust scientific community, a free and independent press, and a government that's responsive to the needs of its citizens.
It's about creating those feedback loops that allow us to course correct, to learn from our errors, and to adapt to changing circumstances.
And finally, I think Ferguson is calling for a shift in our collective narrative, a move away from those doom-laden prophecies and towards a more nuanced and hopeful vision of the future.
It's about reclaiming our agency, recognizing our capacity for both good and bad, and choosing to focus our energies on building a world that's more just sustainable and resilient.
I think that's a beautiful way to sum it up. It's not about denying the risks or ignoring the challenges. It's about embracing our responsibility, our creativity, and our capacity for hope in the face of uncertainty.
Well said. I think we've come full circle in our deep dive into doom. We've explored the history, the science, the politics, and the philosophy of disaster. And while it's certainly been a thought-provoking and at times unsettling journey, I'm walking away with a sense of cautious optimism.
Me too. I think Ferguson, despite his penchant for exploring the darker side of human history, ultimately offers us a message of hope. He reminds us that we have the tools, the knowledge, and the capacity to create a better future, but it's up to us to make the right choices.
It's about embracing complexity, acknowledging uncertainty, and using our collective wisdom to navigate the challenges ahead. So to our listeners, we encourage you to pick up Doom for yourself. It's a challenging read, but it's also incredibly rewarding. It will make you think, it will make you question, and it will hopefully inspire you to become more informed, engaged, and resilient citizen of this complex and ever-evolving world.
And who knows, maybe by facing our fears, by understanding the nature of doom, we can actually create a future that's a little less doomed and a lot more hopeful. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.